All right. So I said tonight that we would talk about the secret of Zivug. The word Zivug in Hebrew really means a number of different things, but essentially it primarily means the idea of coupling or mating or bringing together two elements and combining them. It's essentially called Zivug. In Kabbalistic terminology, it's generally used to describe the interaction between two partzufim. What's a partzuf? Let me just write the word partzuf over here. Partzuf, it's in the chat, right? Partzuf, the word partzuf. Generally, the idea of Zivug is to make two, to bring together two partzufim and to mate the two partzufim, so to speak. What's a partzuf? A partzuf is essentially a sphera or a cluster of sphirot, but a sphera or cluster of sphirot that is in relationship with another sphera or another cluster of sphirot. We've spoken about this a number of times before. In fact, even last week we spoke about this a little bit. Abraham, for instance, before he came to be called Abraham, he was called Avram, which is a hint to the level that he was at. Av is the partzuf of Abba. Abba is essentially Chochmah, the sphere of Chochmah, but it is Chochmah in relationship to other sphirot. Let me get a sphirot chart up here, and here we go. This should do the trick. 1 second, let me... Okay. I'll share screen again. And here we go. Okay. So the Sphira of Chochmah is called Abba. Abba literally means a father. Right? The father. Why? Because the function of the Sphira of Chochmah is similar to or comparable to the function of a father in a family. Bina is called Ima. Another name for Bina is Ima, but it's Bina when it's in relationship to other Sphirot, primarily in relationship to the Sphira of Chochmah, or in relationship to in which case they're called Av Va'em, mother, father and mother, or in relationship to the rest of the Sphirot, in relationship to the 6 Sphirot of Zer Anpin, which is also called Ben or Ban, Ben, right? Ben, meaning the son. So that would be, Bina would be the mother, and those 6 Sphirot would be the son, right? They call the son of the mother. And Malchut is called the daughter of the mother, right? The daughter of both parents, essentially, but the mother's daughter, Malchut. The mother of the son, Em Habonim, the mother of the children, Smecha is happy. That's a verse. So, when the Sphirot are in relationship to others, they are called Partzufim. Literally, a partzuf, literally translated, would probably be a countenance, like a face, a countenance. Now, when Chochmah and Bina work together to produce a certain result, which we would call their offspring, so when Abba ve'Ima or Chochmah and Bina join, that joining to do something else, to produce something else, called a Zivug. A mating, so to speak, of the Sphirot. Mating is kind of a coarse word for what is essentially a very refined idea. Now, the Sefer Yetzirah, the book of formation, the Sefer Yetzirah, which is traditionally understood to have been written by Abraham, was actually transmitted by Abraham. He taught the Sefer Yetzirah, was written down many generations later in the time of the Second Temple, the end of the Second Temple. It was written down by Rabbi Akiva, the famous Rabbi Akiva, called Sefer Yetzirah, the book of formation. So the Sefer Yetzirah talks about three covenants, or three britim. Yeah, brit is a covenant in Hebrew, brit. The brit that we are most familiar with and the one that everybody talks about is the brit of corresponding to Yesod. Yesod corresponds in the Sfirot to the male organ, and the circumcision of the male organ is called Brit HaYesod, the covenant that God made with Abraham to circumcise his descendants, to circumcise himself and his descendants. That was called the Brit Avraham, the Brit or Brit HaYesod of Avraham, the circumcision and the covenant that God made with Abraham, that he would circumcise his progeny, his male descendants, in order to, what was the purpose of this? In order to make a special pact, a special ability to be able to connect to the divine in a way that could not be done before, which is why Abraham was not able to have a child. I'll get back to this in a minute. Was not able to have a child until after he had his Brit Milah, until after he was circumcised. Prior to his circumcision, he could not have a child. I'll explain this in a second. This is actually what I want to get to. So that is the first covenant and the first circumcision. There's a circumcision of the male organ. Then there's a higher level circumcision or a higher level covenant, which is called Brit HaLashon, the covenant of the tongue, the covenant of the tongue. And there is also the circumcision of the tongue. What does that mean? That means that speech has been sufficiently controlled by the godly soul that it will not cause destruction. You know, they say about Joan of Arc, the famous Joan of Arc, that she launched, her face launched 1,000 ships. Why? Because there was wars fought over Joan of Arc. But wars are very often fought over statements, things that people say. And whether it's talking about national, international wars, or whether we're talking about local wars, you know, like the wars in your house when you tell your kids to do something, they don't do it, or when you say something disparaging to your wife or to your husband or whatever it is, unfortunately, and that can become a cause of a whole battle that goes on between the husband and the wife, between the parents and the children, and so on and so forth. All right. So learning how to control one's speech and learning how to direct it and to say the right things and to say the truth is called Brit HaLashon, the circumcision of the tongue. Then the highest level of circumcision, the highest level of covenant, is called the covenant of the heart, or Brit HaLev, the covenant of the heart, which is the covenant of the emotions, where essentially the emotions are pure enough to be able to come into a covenant with the Almighty, with the divine. The emotions are so pure that one can come into a relationship with God in a way that can be felt in the heart, in a way that can be understood and appreciated and contained within the heart. Now, these three covenants also correspond to three types of zivug. The truth is that Kabbalah talks about 5 different zivugim. There are 5 zivugim, but I'm not going to go into those now. I want to talk mainly about the 3 zivugim, which are the zivug halev. The zivug meaning again the mating of hearts, or let's call it the meeting of hearts. Mating sounds like something like animals do. I can't think of a better word offhand. If anyone else can think of a better word, rather than mating, so tell me. Coupling, interacting, perhaps. In any event, there's 3 types of coupling or 3 types of interaction. There's the interaction of the heart. There's the interaction of the mouth, the lips, speech. So emotions, and emotions don't only mean emotions, they also mean thought, the interaction of thought and emotions, they go together. The interaction of speech and the interaction of the procreative organs, the male organ and the female organ, or Yesod and Malchut. Yesod, the male organ, Malchut, corresponding to the female organ. So there are 3 zivugim. There are 3 couplings. We mentioned last week that Abraham was on an extremely high level, to the extent that he's told by God to descend, at least according to one of the explanations. The soul of Abraham up there is told to descend down into this world, into the body, into the physical world, in order to change and to improve the physical world. The first zivug, the highest level of zivug, the zivug of the zivug halev and the brit halev, the of heart to heart and mind to mind, is an extremely high level of zivug. That's the zivug between chokhmah and bina. That's the zivug between chokhmah and bina. When chokhmah and bina connect, that's called the understanding of the heart. Bina uba halev mevin. The heart understands through bina. So when bina and chokhmah mate, so to speak, when they combine, when they couple together, that's called the zivug of the heart. Then there's the zivug of speech. Essentially, when the emotions produce words. Speech is associated with Malchut, but we're talking here about how the emotions produce speech. So that's called, again, Zivug Hapeh, the coupling of the mouth, when the mouth and the emotions form a unity. The final one, and on the face of it, the lowest one, is the physical zivug, the physical coupling of male and female, Yesod and Malchut, in the process of mating. Now, again, it's a word I don't like to use because it sounds like animals, but let's say the interaction of male and female on a physical level. Let's put it that way. Now, prior, as I said before, prior to Abraham being circumcised, this connection over here, the connection of Malchut and Yesod, or Yesod and Malchut, did not produce any children for Abraham and Sarah. Did not produce any children for Abraham and Sarah. Right. Speech and action. Right. Why did it not produce any children? One explanation is that Abraham did not yet have he wasn't yet circumcised. Another explanation is that Abraham and Sarah were so deeply entrenched in each other, I don't know another word for it, but so deeply coupled together on a spiritual level that the physical integration, that's a very good word. Thank you, Terry. Yeah, integration, that's an excellent word, in fact. The integration of Abraham and Sarah was on such a lofty level that it could not possibly result in a physical being. Their integration was so lofty that it only produced souls. It didn't produce bodies. It produced souls, but not bodies. That is why, it's one of the explanations why when Abraham went down to Egypt and later on when he went again to Avimelech in Gerar, in a country called Gerar, an area called Gerar, he said to Sarah to say that she was his sister. Now, yes, they were married, true. The reason for saying so was because he was worried that the ostensible reason is that he was worried that this was a place that when they went down to Egypt in particular, as in fact happened, Pharaoh set his eyes on Sarah and wanted to take her as one of his wives into his harem, into his bordello, I suppose you could say. So Abraham was extremely worried at that time that this would happen, and if Sarah was married to him at the time, if they were married, then that would be a defilement of their marriage, a defilement of their relationship. So according to the simple explanation, straightforward explanation, he says, tell everybody that you are my sister. Meaning to say he relinquished that relationship of marriage to his wife, and now she was only like his sister. In fact, later on he says that in fact she was his sister, not really his sister, but they had a common grandfather. So, sister in a sense, grand sister, I suppose you could say. In any event, the idea here was that he was sort of, in a sense, disowning that relationship, so that if Sarah would be taken by Pharaoh, which in fact happened, there wouldn't be any sin involved because she was no longer officially married. In the days before the Torah was given, a declaration was sufficient to undo a marriage. The declaration of, you say you're my sister, you're no longer my wife. That would be enough. However, that's only the straightforward, simple explanation. The deeper Kabbalistic explanation is that Abraham and Sarah were like brother and sister in the sense that their Zivug, their integration, was only on a soul level, on the level of the heart. There was no integration on the level of the body, or there was no integration that could produce another body, could produce another being. And that's why she says, truthfully, I'm his sister. And he says, she's my sister. Or she would have said, he's my brother. And it was only after their going down to Pharaoh and then subsequently with Avimelech, the king of Gerar, that Abraham had children. One of the explanations that's given, which is given in the name of the Maggid Mezrich, is that Avimelech somehow or another aroused in Abraham sufficient physical desire, not desire for the physical, but desire for the integration on a physical level. I'm just going to answer a question quickly. Does the lofty integration of Abraham and Sarah need to fall back to meet the needs of Egypt to possibly move them forward? We all need to move up the sphere, starting in Malchut. If by that what you mean is that Sarah had to be taken to Pharaoh in order to elevate Pharaoh, that is to a certain extent what happened, but there was actually no, he was unable to touch her. He was unable to touch her. He was struck by plague the night that he took her, and he could not, he couldn't have any physical contact with her. If that's what you're asking. But yes, the move down to Egypt was actually, there's several explanations. One of them is that they went down to Egypt as a Maisa Avois Simon Labanim. What the forefathers did was a sign for their children. Abraham went into exile in Egypt on a temporary basis, just as his children would become slaves in Egypt on a temporary basis and then leave and return to their original dwelling place, which was the land of Israel. In any event, they explained that it was because of Avimelech. This was a later incident when Abraham and Sarah went down to Gerar because there was a famine in the land. They went to Gerar, and Avimelech again took Sarah as his wife, but also was unable to consummate the relationship because, because an angel revealed to Avimelech that she was married, she was Abraham's wife. And he immediately relinquished her and sent her back. It's a whole story. I don't want to get into all the details of it. You can read it in the in the biblical account in the parasha is called Vayera. This week's biblical reading, this week's Torah reading. In any event, the idea is that this finally aroused the physical, the desire for physical integration, and that was then able to, after the circumcision, was then able to produce Isaac, the child that they had together. Now, we might think, and this would be a logical thing to think, although it is incorrect, we would think that the zivug of heart to heart and of mouth to mouth, of speech to speech, is a higher level of zivug than the zivug of physical contact with a male organ and female organ. And that is true, and to a certain extent it is a higher contact. However, it is only the physical zivug, male and female, that can bring about new life in the world. In other words, bring about a child, can produce a child. Only that zivug can produce a child. So it's explained that even though it would seem to be a lower type of zivug, a lower type of connection, of integration, nevertheless, the truth is that this is what brings down divine energy into the world, giving birth to it, which gives birth to a child, which produces a child. As the Talmud explains, there are three partners in producing a child. There's the father and the mother, and each of them gives different aspects of the physicality of the child. As we know, the DNA of the child comes from both a mingling of the DNA of the father and the mother. But the soul is given by God. The actual life force that's given by God. So the physical is given by the two partners, but the life force is given by God. In other words, basically meaning to say that it's the physical zivug that is, in a sense, the highest one. It can bring new life into the world. Now, this is explained again in Kabbalistic works, and particularly in Hasidic works, explain that this corresponds to the zivug of Torah study, which is essentially the mind, and the zivug of prayer, which is essentially the mouth, and the zivug of mitzvot meaning the commandments, fulfilling the physical commandments, fulfilling the commandments. It's the fulfilling of the commandments in a physical sense, doing the actual physical acts of the commandments rather than having the intentions or having the meditations or having the consciousness and so on. It's the physical deeds that bring forth divine energy into the world. So ultimately, this whole story about Abraham and Sarah, and their integration to produce Isaac, Yitzchak, is a paradigm for what it is that we're supposed to do in the world. As I've described and explained many, many times, meditating, praying, studying, these are wonderful things. These are extremely important things. Life without them is just not the same thing. But don't forget the component of the physical. In other words, the actual doing of the deeds. Even someone who studies and knows backwards and forwards all the laws to do with, let's say, for example, charity. There's laws of charity in the Jewish code of law, the code of Jewish law, about who you should give to and who takes precedence and what percentage you should give and so on and so forth. There's many, many laws about charity. So even someone who studies it and understands the deeper dimensions of it and what's going on in the spiritual world when it happens, but he doesn't actually ever give any charity, has not fulfilled the commandment of giving charity. He hasn't fulfilled the ultimate deal, which is actually to give the charity. Now, the same thing would be true with, let's say, the laws of Sabbath. There's many, many, many laws associated with the Sabbath, what you can do, what you should do, what you can't do, and so on and so forth on the Sabbath. But if one learns all of the laws but doesn't keep the Sabbath, so you've missed the soul of the thing, even though it would only seem to be a physical component and would not seem to be that important, cessation from work. Maybe you would think that it's less important than focusing on spiritual matters. The answer is both of them are very important, but it is the actual fulfillment of the mitzvot, of the commandments, in a physical sense, that elicits the divine energy which changes the world. So therefore, this story, like all other stories in the Torah, are really paradigms of much, much deeper ideas. And the deepest idea that we have to glean from this is that Hamaisa hu ha'ikar, the deed is the most important thing. The deed is the most important thing, because if one does the deed, even without intention, even without the meditations, even without the prayer, even without understanding, the deed has been done, and that is sufficient. It's not perfect, but it's certainly sufficient. Okay, Let me address some questions over here. Abraham could have relied on Hashem to save him, and therefore she was his wife. In this relying on a miracle rather than trying to solve things himself, he used deception. Sarah actually saved her and Abraham according to Kabbalah because of Sarah's deeds. Yes, Sarah actually saved her and Abraham. That is correct. And there are opinions, like the Ramban, for example, Nachmanides, Rabbi Moshe ben Nachman, that sort of criticizes Abraham for not having enough faith to tell the truth and say things the way they are. Now, this is a very troublesome idea in many ways. That we find that some of the figures in the Torah sometimes say things which are not exactly true, like Abraham said to Sarah to say that he was her brother, she was his sister, and that happened with Isaac as well. And we find that at certain points in the Torah that sometimes a lie is told, or an untruth, let's put it that way. So it's explained, interestingly enough, it's explained in Kabbalah that the only reason that sometimes has to be the case, that sometimes has to be the case is because the original, the first sin which tainted the world was done through deception, and therefore it can only be undone through deception. Now, there's a whole idea that needs to be deeply explored and examined and explained. Don't get the wrong idea that deception is necessarily a good thing. But sometimes deception is necessary. The Baal Shem Tov was known to pretend to be a very unlearned peasant. Now, why did he do that? Not simply because he was a very, very humble person, but there was obviously a deeper intention in it. Sometimes that deception was necessary in order to achieve things that he otherwise would not have been able to achieve. And we can see that deception in and of itself is sometimes a useful, although not an ideal, characteristic, an ideal activity. I hope that answers that question. So there's a big difference between knowing the path and walking the path, exactly. That is the primary difference. Knowing the path may be a prerequisite to walking the path, but if the truth be told, since knowledge is infinite and there's no end to being able to learn, if one waits until one is sufficiently knowledgeable to be able to walk the path, one has missed out on all the walking of the path that one could actually have done. So it's best to combine the two. And in fact, there are those who explain, and this is in fact borne out in experience, that only through walking the path can you come to understand it, can you come to know it. Yes, you can learn things in theory, but putting things into practice makes the theory come alive. And without putting things into practice, without walking the path, you will never get to real knowledge of the path. Just as I'm sure we've all experienced that without a certain amount of trial and error, we really would not understand how to do things in the proper way. Marty, we also taught not to rely on miracles. Abraham needed to act on his own. True. Integration, Wendy says, integration between men and women happens all the time, and relatively infrequently a child is conceived. However, the couple's integration still provides a mingling of their energies. True. And all married couples know this is true. Very special energy enters the relationship when this physical component is cultivated. This is holy in itself, perhaps. Yes, it has to be. It has to be made holy because of the circumstances in which we live, and because of the deception of the serpent and Eve, and so on and so forth. So, physical zivug does not present itself as something holy to start off with. It has to be made holy. So the unity of flesh with flesh, as it's called, Yihud Abasa Babasar, or Zivug Basa Babasar, is something that has to be imbued with holiness. It's not necessarily naturally like that. Maybe in some circumstances, but generally it has to be imbued with holiness. Now, what does holiness mean in this case? Holiness means in this case refraining from the expression is used in the, the rabbinic expression is refraining from copulating like chickens, right? Or reproducing like rabbits, I suppose you could say. In other words, there's a time and a place. It's not just any time and any place. In Kabbalistic terms, the ideal time for physical contact, physical zivug, is on Friday night on the Sabbath, and preferably after midnight. Why? Because then a certain zivug of the sfirot takes place. It's called the zivug of Yaakov and Rachel, or Yaakov and Rachel. Takes place at that time, and therefore it's actually a very holy time, and a time that's auspicious and propitious for a physical zivug as well. Doesn't mean to say that it's forbidden necessarily to have relations at any other time. It's not forbidden, but there are times that it is forbidden, yes. But when it is permissible, it's not necessarily holy, but it is permissible. Holy times are at that time, and the idea is that it should be that the physical zivug should be an expression of a coming together of souls through the physical body, coming together of souls through the physical. In other words, it's not just physical passion that's involved, but it's physical passion that brings together two souls. Therefore, sort of, I don't know how to put it exactly, but kind of casual relations, which have no meaning, are very much frowned upon in the Torah. In other words, casual relations, one-night stands, I think they call them in the vernacular, are anathema. Why? Because that's not called zivug. That's not the proper channeling of one's procreative energy into this full integration, and therefore the seed is essentially wasted. The male seed, the female seed is essentially wasted, and that leads to all kinds of negative consequences and circumstances and so on. But even when it was permitted, but it's not done with love and with a higher purpose in mind, it's not ideal. Of course, if only the higher purpose is in mind, that's also not ideal. There has to be also physical integration at some point in time. Okay, how does this relate, Marty asked, to other means to conceive of couples that cannot conceive simply through sex? That is an interesting question. I don't know the answer to it offhand. I would have to think it through and look at some sources. But very often, parents cannot have children under certain circumstances. If the circumstances change, if the circumstances are changed, then it can change the physical result. I'm being a little bit cryptic here, I know. I'm talking about various Kabbalistic means, whether it is using sabulas or whether it is using blessings, whether one gets a blessing from a holy person, or whether one concentrates on certain ideas and certain maybe holy names and so on and so forth at the time of having relations, that can produce children where it couldn't produce them before. There also has to be there's certain circumstances. If anyone is stricken by this malady, perhaps you can have a private discussion. It's not something that we really talk about so much in public, but yes, drugs can help. Fertility drugs can certainly help. But again, even when using fertility drugs, the actual moment of intimacy should be an act of holiness and a meditation in itself, rather than simply physical pleasure exclusively. Of course, there's physical pleasure involved, but that's meant to be that way. It's not a sin. It's not an evil thing. It just needs to be controlled, and it needs to be directed. Okay. Alrighty. Okay, so we'll call it a day unless there's some more questions. Yep. Okay. So there you go. And I will see you next time around. Next week, hopefully.